Hello again, everyone. Welcome to today's event on the China-Russia Nexus of Disinformation. My name is David Salvo. I'm the Managing Director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. I'm joined here by my colleague, Brett Schaefer, also of the Alliance for Securing Democracy, and representatives of Radio Free Asia and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. We're really thrilled to have such terrific expertise on today's panel to discuss a really timely topic. I think we've long associated disinformation and information manipulation writ large with the government of the Russian Federation, but certainly the People's Republic of China has caught up. We now see state actors and state-sponsored media from both countries waging information operations around the globe to advance their interests and to undermine the interests of the United States and our allies and partners. Our discussion today will focus on whether there really is indeed a nexus between these two governments in their information campaigns, what methods the regimes do use to wage information operations around the world, and where specifically do they hone these tactics. We'll also discuss these issues in the context of an all-important election year here in 2024. As many of you know, Taiwan recently held elections, and this is a great framing to discuss the PRC's information manipulation tactics. We've recently commemorated the two-year mark of the Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and that, of course, is a necessary framing to discuss Russia's information operations around the globe. And there are many other elections on the horizon. I don't need to delineate which ones. I think we all know which, that both nation states will have their eye on in terms of conducting information operations, again, around the globe. We have a great panel to tackle these questions. RFA and RFERL are covering these issues every day in the field. Here at GMF, ASD is tracking state-sponsored narratives around the globe through our Hamilton 2.0 dashboard. So there's a lot of ground to cover. I will quickly go over the ground rules, introduce our speakers, and we'll just dive into the conversation. So quickly, ground rules. This is an on-the-record conversation, which is good since we are working with journalists here, so they know this all too well. It is open to media and attribution. And audience members, please feel free to ask questions using the chat function in Zoom. Q&A function, sorry, not the chat function, the Q&A function, important delineation, thank you. And we will get to as many as we can. We will definitely leave time for audience Q&A. So our panelists, Min Mitchell, who's the executive editor of Radio Free Asia. She oversees company-wide editorial operations. She's been instrumental in developing RFA's comprehensive editorial strategy to match the fast-evolving needs of audiences in Asia and globally, as well as addressing the challenges posed by the global rise of authoritarianism and disinformation, which of course go hand in hand. She's led the development of RFA's Asia Fact Check Lab, which debunks falsehood and tracks the spread of malign influence and propaganda seeded in misleading narratives, such as a recent surge in China-Russia coordinated misinformation on the war in Ukraine and Chinese interference in the 2024 Taiwan presidential election, two issues we will certainly cover today. Brett Schaefer is the Senior Fellow for Media and Digital Disinformation here at the German Marshall Fund at the Alliance for Securing Democracy. He heads our information manipulation team. He's the creator and manager of the aforementioned Hamilton 2.0 dashboard, which is an online open source dashboard tracking the outputs of Russian, Chinese, and Iranian state media outlets, diplomats, and government officials across numerous media platforms. He's an expert in computational propaganda, state-backed information operations, and tech regulation. And he's spoken at conferences around the globe and advised numerous governments and NGOs on these very issues. And finally, we have Reed Standish. He's the correspondent for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, based in Prague, and the author of the China in Eurasia Briefing. He focuses on Chinese foreign policy in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and has reported extensively about China's Belt and Road Initiative and Beijing's internment camps in Xinjiang. Prior to joining RFERL, Reed was also an editor at Foreign Policy magazine and its Moscow correspondent. He's also written for The Atlantic and The Washington Post. So with that, let's dive in. We should start with sort of the all-important question because it's been covered, but I don't know if anyone really has sort of the magic answer to the question, is there actually a nexus of Russian and PRC information operations? Is there a true convergence in the tactics and methods that these that these two governments use? And if so, what are they? And if not, where do they diverge? So Min, why don't I start with you to maybe set the scene, and then Reed and Brent can chime in as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, David, for hosting this timely discussion. It's a pleasure and honor to be on this great panel with people I admire greatly. And I also want to thank you for inviting me, and congratulations for your outstanding work through the Alliance for Securing Democracy project. So let me offer my observations on Russian and specifically Chinese information manipulation tactics and how they diverge first. So as you all know better than I, Russian information manipulation traditionally has focused on amplifying rumors to sow seeds of distrust in the West and in countries that lean to the West. That means undermining NATO, the EU, Ukraine, Poland, Baltic countries, and of course, the United States, among many other countries. They have become very adept at using local journalists, media, and social media accounts to make disinformation seem organic. And on the other side, the Chinese Communist Party's information manipulation has traditionally been aimed at its own population. But over the past decade, the CCP has focused more and more on reaching Chinese-speaking populations overseas. Their main purpose has been to burnish the record of CCP, denigrate the United States, and convey how Western democracy is deficient and not appropriate for the Chinese people. Most recently, however, China has begun deploying Russian-style disinformation tactics. There are a few examples. During the COVID pandemic, for instance, Beijing amplified bogus stories seeking to deflect attention to itself over the pandemic's origin by pushing the narrative that the United States military may have been the source of COVID, as you all know. And I should also add, when CCP covered up its underreported fatalities and mishandling of its response in Wuhan early on, Radio Free Asia is among the first to report fatalities being much, much higher. And Taiwan, as we just talked about, of course, has been the leading target of CCP disinformation, providing a window into their evolving methods. According to the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, for 10 years straight, Taiwan has been the country most impacted by foreign disinformation. And RFA, through its Asia Fact Check Lab, which we established in 2022, closely covered how the CCP has distorted news and spread falsehoods about Taiwan, efforts which intensified in advance of Taiwan's national election in January 2024. This included campaigns by state-backed media, as well as rumor recycled on Chinese social media. So the CCP is fully aware of the vulnerabilities in Taiwan's media space and has become quite adept at striking its weak points. In the process, it has gained considerable experience in disinformation campaigns. And as reported by our fact check lab, CCP disseminated messages, for instance, sought to promote themes like doubt about the US commitment to Taiwan's security. One campaign pushed the narrative that the US sees Taiwan as merely a bargaining chip and will abandon it eventually. And another sub-narrative was that the US plans to destroy Taiwan's semiconductor giant TSMC to hurt China. And another message tried to increase anxiety about inevitable invasion and conflict. This includes inciting fear in ordinary Taiwanese that Chinese military will attack the island if the wrong candidate wins. And another message sought to convince Taiwanese that the US and the West engage in election interference. And this includes narratives that the US is backing specific candidates and parties. And our Asia Fact Check Lab found CCP was actually connected to a fake election pool in order to favor their interest. And this report got cited by Taiwan's foreign minister just days before the election. And speaking of where Russia and China, their tactics converge, I have an example. As you know, Russia has pushed the story about bioweapon lab that U.S. was helping Ukraine to build during their invasion. And guess what? There is a crazy story we fact-checked that involves the same narrative that U.S. and the Taiwanese official secretly met in South China Sea in 2022 to discuss creating a bioweapon lab. It was all over Chinese state media and social platforms. And it even reached my own parents' line group. It's a communication app like WhatsApp in Taiwan. I'm originally from Taiwan and my parents still live there. So my parents' 80-year-old friends shared the story in their group chat, and they got into this heated argument about whether the US is inciting a war between Taiwan and China. And my parents sent it to me. I returned the text with our fact check story. My mom wrote back, "Is your story true?" So my mom demonstrates that while Taiwan has steadily enhanced its resilience against CCP's information manipulation, Chinese influence operations are becoming more and more skillful and more like Russia in its tactics. With that, I will give it back to David, and maybe my colleague Reed can elaborate on this.
Thanks, Min. Yeah, Reed and Brett, maybe if you have two fingers on that to sort of flesh out some of those comments.
Sure. Pleasure to. Well, thank you guys all for having me here. So, I mean, I think, you know, the name of this, you know, we're talking about collaboration, which maybe that is kind of the right word here. You know, there's growing cooperation happening between the Russians and the Chinese, but I think it's still really unclear if you can say any of this is coordinated in any way. I think by most accounts, it's not. Rather, you know, there's a lot of watching, copying, and learning. And I think the thing we're seeing is a lot more of sort of formalized ways of learning and sharing tactics. And that's a lot of what's going on. You know, talking about Ukraine, you know, Min brought up the example about the bioweapons, or sorry, the biolabs, which is a thing that's been cycled around in Russia for forever. But I think also around the war in Ukraine, I mean, there was a lot of these really Russian state media disinformation tactics that have been around for a long time that really started popping up on the Chinese networks through Chinese platforms. You know, there's things about covering over the Bucha massacre that happened in Ukraine, you know, saying that that was a hoax. You know, there's a lot of stuff about George Soros conspiracy theories and things like that popping up in a lot of cases, sort of almost word for word for how they appear in the Russian press. But I think more what's been a little bit interesting around Ukraine, especially when you look at how the Chinese have tackled it, you know, there's a lot of that is geared around discrediting the United States. It's about, you know, showing that there's holes in Western resolve, that, you know, this war is the fault of NATO, and especially in the first year and maybe a little bit after that, there was a really strong narrative there about, you know, giving cover for Russia, its own narrative and its justifications for invading in the first place. And I think obviously we know Chinese media, Chinese officials, they've never called it actually an invasion since day one, and kind of go to great lengths to avoid all of that. So, you know, I think zooming back a little bit from that and like where we are in this moment, you know, we want to talk about Russia and China, what kind of cooperation exists there. You know, I think it's important to note, you know, this is in some ways, the fact that we're talking about this now is this culmination of like a decade of newfound agreements that have been happening between China and Russia, essentially since Xi came to power. Actually, the very first meeting that Putin and Xi had together as official heads of state, they did sign a big agreement on information cooperation, sharing, you know, fighting as, you know, basically about keeping Western information out of Russia and China. And that's really expanded quite a lot. And I think that's, you know, when we're talking about the war, right, we're talking about collaborating on these narratives. But really, I think a big point of what's happening at the war while they're doing stuff abroad, it's really about the coordination and the learning that is happening that's getting applied back at home for their domestic audiences and what they're feeding them. So, a few years ago, there was some hacked documents that came out that talked about a deal between Russia and Chinese state-led outlets, basically about sharing content, best practices, organizing exchanges, and co-producing a bunch of different shows. And also say that at Radio for Europe last year, we also got this big trove of hacked documents that showed all these various meetings that had happened from 2017 to 2019 between Roskomnadzor, which is the government agency that's charged with policing Russia's internet, and then the Cyberspace Administration of China. And those files really gave us this interesting behind the scenes look into what was happening at a very practical level. And a lot of that, we see these kind of, to be honest, having listened to a lot of those recordings, quite boring conversations, very boardrooms, translators, all of those kind of things. But it is really, it's a focus on learning best practices. And it's really interesting because, you can really see what the other one thinks that the other one is doing better than them and how they can learn from that and how they can apply that to suit their own needs. And it also shows us a lot of what they're concerned about, what they're focused on, which there's some divergence that's happening there. So, for instance, the Russian officials, they're asking the Chinese for guidance on how to disrupt VPNs, how to deal with Tor, how to better attack and crack encrypted internet traffic and messaging platforms. And the Russians also wanted to arrange a visit to China to send specialists there to study how the Great Firewall worked in better detail. So about, really censoring and controlling the flows of information at home in that really technical aspect. The Russians were really trying to zero in on that from the Chinese. And then the Chinese priorities, I think, were also pretty illuminating, especially if we think about what Min was saying about China really looking, cares a lot about its image, trying to portray itself as this leader of the global South in a lot of ways. So they were looking at, the ways that Russia can control information online to curb protests. They were also looking at how what they called, Russia's image making abroad. They really were quite curious about that and asking to learn more on that. And then also some very, interesting asking to, block content inside Russia about Xinjiang, Uyghurs. Curiously, this very old 60 Minutes interview with Jiang Zemin, I think it's because he talks about the Tiananmen Square protests there. So it really kind of shows us what's happening. It's not just abroad what we're talking about. There's this two-way flow, and a lot of what's getting, I think, learned and applied at home is also getting sent out and used abroad as there's that learning. And so maybe I'll leave it there and turn it back to you guys, but I think there's also still a lot more to dig in there.
Thanks. There's lots of comments on there. There's also one thread I would love if you could pull, since you're studying sort of the overt space.
Mm-hmm.
I like how Reed sort of framed what's happening maybe behind the scenes in the gray disinformation world. But there's something that Min mentioned where she said that the PRC focuses a lot on its diaspora overseas, but they've also, as Reed just said, asked Russia for help with its image making tactics, which suggests maybe an evolution in its target audience. And I'm wondering if you see anything that suggests that the PRC is increasingly focused on, say, foreign speaking audiences as opposed to Mandarin speaking diaspora groups overseas, or whether that's still really like part and parcel of what they're trying to accomplish.
Well, I mean, one of the interesting things that we've looked at since we started studying both countries around 2019, 2020, is the Kremlin used to be very different from what we saw from China, and that the Kremlin really didn't talk about Russia with its external messaging. So when we did an analysis of every YouTube video published on RT America over a course of a year or two, something like 4% of those videos even mentioned Russia. And when we did the same thing with CGTN, it was roughly 25%. So China really was still attempting to present this positive image of China to the world, where Russia, frankly, didn't really care. It wasn't about attracting audiences to Russia. It was about repelling them from their adversaries. We've seen China shift in the Russian direction for the last couple of years, but I'd say in the last year or so, they've maybe shifted back in the other direction. So a lot of coverage in the media is focused on China's wolf warrior diplomacy style. And we certainly saw, it wasn't all of Chinese diplomats, and it certainly wasn't all of their embassy accounts, but maybe 20 or 30 of their most vocal diplomats on Twitter adopted this very aggressive confrontational style, and were sort of dubbed the wolf warriors. I think China has found that that's really not an effective strategy for building China's image globally. Yes, it was very good at attracting audiences on Twitter. I mean, those were the people who had huge followings. So when you talk about Zhao Lijian, for example, who's China's, I think he was the #2 spokesperson in the Chinese MFA, he had something like 1 million followers and had attracted this huge sort of cult following on Twitter. But I don't think that was really helping China in terms of their public diplomacy and their efforts to present China positively on the world stage. And now he is heading, I think, the Boundary and Ocean Department. So he's been sidelined. And we've seen other sort of these fringy Chinese diplomats, like the Consul General in Belfast, who used to, when we had Twitter access on Hamilton, almost every week, she was the #1 account of all of the Chinese accounts we tracked on Twitter, or now X. Basically because she was confrontational, she was conspiratorial, and her rhetoric has totally shifted over the last 6 months. So I think the wolf warrior style has been drawn back a little bit, because I think the higher ups realize that ultimately it's not all that effective, especially in Europe. So I think China's fine being confrontational with the United States. If you're talking about the nexus between China and Russia, the glue there is anti-Americanism. If you look at their outlets globally, that's the one commonality. But I think the confrontational style directed at Europe, I don't think they found that to be a winning approach. So we've seen the pendulum has sort of swung back to what we saw in 2019, 2020, where it's more about presenting China as a great partner on the world stage.
Interesting. And in terms of the audience, Reed and Min, are you noticing that there's maybe less of a focus of targeting the diasporas overseas, or Min, especially since you are looking at this every day, or as Brett said, is there more of an image, more of an attempt to portray the PRC as like a constructive partner on the global stage? Because there's been a lot of media coverage about like Chinese interference, for example, in elections and targeting ethnic Chinese diaspora groups. So I'm wondering sort of where this all fits together.
Yeah, China is definitely reaching out to its overseas population. And a lot of them, even outside China, they still live in their Weibo and WeChat bubbles. So that's a very powerful machine that these disinformation still circulate in the overseas. And I think this is what they are really like expanding their disinformation campaign globally. And I also want to go back to a little bit on Ukraine and Taiwan. So our fact check lab worked with Dictator Media, IRI, and Doublethink Lab did a research report on Ukraine, China, Russia, Ukraine. And there's a there's some really interesting findings that I would like to share. Like one technique observed that the indirect or direct quoting of Russian officials or Russian media in Mandarin with very little identified divergence in Russian and Chinese narratives concerning the invasion of Ukraine. And the analysis indicates there are two overarching themes observed in both languages. First, it's anti-American and anti-Western sentiment. And second, it's positioning Russia as a victim or hero. So, these are all very interesting trends to see how they are collaborating together. And RT is actually the only foreign media that's officially allowed in China. I'll just stop here for Reed.
Yeah, sure. I can build off that a bit. So, I mean, I think especially in my job, I'm looking much more at the, say reaching other parts of the world rather than the Chinese or Mandarin speaking diasporas around there. And I think, if we take Ukraine and if we can throw Gaza into there, I mean, I think that maybe isn't even really disinformation, or it's partly disinformation, more propaganda, but it's, you know, given a lot of fodder to it. There's a lot of fuel for China to cook with, a lot of ingredients to bring into the propaganda disinformation kitchen. You know, it is really this anti-US message, like quite transparently so. But that resonates in a lot of the world, right? And I think especially, you know, it is not a secret. I think China has been courting the global South for quite some time. You know, well before either of those conflicts, it's been investing in overseas media. You know, if you talk about Africa, I believe that Xinhua has the largest network of foreign correspondents there. You know, there's been billions that have been put into there. It's also into the Middle East. We can even talk about some areas across the former Soviet Union. You're starting to see Chinese networks set up affiliates there as well. So there is this big expansion. And yeah, I think a lot of it is around partly boosting image making, partly, you know, boosting a bit of those, you know, those big sensitive areas that China cares a lot about, Taiwan, you know, especially if we're talking about in the Muslim world, things related to Xinjiang and the crackdown that happened against Uyghurs and other groups there. And so I think that is, you know, there's a lot of ways to amplify that message through all of that. And I think that it's honestly, I think, taking hold quite a ways. You know, maybe for Western audiences, not so much, maybe going actually in the opposite direction. But if we want to talk about Africa, the Middle East, I think that there's quite fertile terrain, and I think it's taking off.
Thanks, Ray. Brett, do you want to maybe explain what you're seeing in the global South? I mean, obviously, you mentioned Middle East and Africa. Latin America has also been a big battleground for competition with the United States, especially from a Russian perspective. What metrics are you seeing from both, you know, state-sponsored media outlets and government officials in these regions?
Yeah, I think we can be a little bit myopic looking at the transatlantic space and sort of gauging the success of Russia and China, just looking at the sort of reactions of publics in Europe and the United States. If you look at the numbers in Latin America in particular, they're pretty staggering when you look at the success of both China and Russia, particularly Russia in Latin America. I pulled numbers the other day of the last year on Facebook, and if you look at the major Spanish language global media outlets, RT en Español is first in terms of followers, in terms of likes. CGTN en Español is second. CNN en Español is third. Univision is fourth. So they are outperforming these major independent Spanish language outlets. Voz de America sits at about 11th of the outlets that we were looking at. And so their reach in the Spanish language markets is enormous. And I think when you talk to colleagues in Colombia and in South America and Central America, the sense is that they are not fringe outlets. They are seen as sort of major global media players, the way that you would look at the BBC here. And it's interesting there that, particularly looking at Russia, the tone is quite different than what you see from RT in Europe and the United States. So in the US, RT Deutsch, RT en Français, they tend to be these sort of right-leaning outlets. In Latin America, RT en Español is very much the sort of traditional anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist, kind of leftist media outlet. And when you do network mapping and look at the communities that are engaging with that content, they tend to be sort of way left-leaning political communities in all of the countries that we've monitored in Latin America. Reed mentioned in Africa, CGTN in Africa does quite well as well. I think it is their, on YouTube, CGTN in Africa, I think is their second most followed channel. So when we only look at the successes of the Kremlin and in Beijing, in Europe, and the United States, we're really missing what's happening in a lot of the world, which I think is honestly more of their focus. There's less competition there in some cases, and there's more opportunity to give their content to authentic, genuine domestic media outlets who are content starved. So Rupley, for example, has been very good about getting their stringer content to outlets in the global South who need stringer footage from Ukraine. And so they've been able to get footage in the hands of domestic media outlets. So it's not just what they're doing through their overt channels, it's also what they're able to distribute through authentic local media outlets as well.
That this might be a good place to pivot and take advantage of Min and Reed's positions as, you know, journalists and editors in the field who are covering these issues sort of on a global scale. I'm curious, sort of, well, two things I'm curious about. One is, how do you ensure that your organizations are looking well beyond national borders to cover this phenomenon of PRC or Russian disinformation, you know, very far afield in Latin America or the Middle East or Africa? So that's one. I'm also curious what newsroom procedures you have in place to make sure that you are not sort of inadvertently amplifying or being the victim of state-sponsored information operations. I mean, this isn't to pick on you, but in the 2016 U.S. presidential election, you know, 30 plus of the major American news outlets were inadvertently amplifying Russian disinformation accounts online. This isn't to say that RFA or RFERL has done this, but I'm curious what you've sort of learned from that experience to ensure that you yourselves are not targeted and inadvertently amplifying these sorts of operations.
Do you want to go first, Ben, or do you want me to hop in?
No, Reed, go first. That's okay.
Sure. I mean, I'll bite off what I can do there. You know, in terms of, I mean, it's a massive problem. I mean, speaking anecdotally, I mean, you look at all the big surveys of every newsroom everywhere. I mean, I think this is the biggest thing that people are identifying as problems for their newsrooms. And then I think you couple that, you know, zooming out a bit, I'll come back to talking specifically about what we do, but, you know, you're talking about all the inroads that have been made in places like Africa, Latin America. You know, part of that is happening because a lot of the traditional gatekeepers, the big outlets are, you know, they're going under, there's layoffs, there's less budgets. You know, so in places like Africa, CGTN can come and, you know, just hire up all these correspondents who don't have a place to work anymore, and they'll happily take up the job. And so that's kind of created a lot of that hole. And I think that's part of the equation too, of just the underfunding and the wider kind of business issues hitting newsrooms on a very practical level that's coming at the exact same time that you have, you know, deepfakes and AI taking over and doing all sorts of stuff that's going to make that even more difficult. I mean, in terms of what we do, you know, we have, you know, public editor, we have a lot that's gone there that's really focused on just trying to make sure that, you know, all the T's are being crossed and the I's are being dotted. And just trying to create in, you know, procedures, you know, when you're dealing with something that is sensitive, you know, you're getting extra eyes on it, you know, just creating all of those, you know, we call them fail safes. But obviously that's easier said than done, especially, you know, you're dealing with all the practical constraints of, all right, you know, is this a time sensitive scoop? We need to rush, we need to move forward. You know, like you're running out of that wiggle room really to go through and be so thorough. It's a hard thing to do in the moment, I think, especially. So I think it's a focus then about making sure you have that editorial muscle behind the scenes. And then also, I think making sure that there's a credibility and a respect. So knowing that, okay, if you're seeing this coming from, you know, from us or from, you know, someone else, you want to know that you have a relationship with your consumer and they're going to trust and respect what's coming out of what they're seeing on your outlet.
Yeah, I will echo Reed on this. I think, you know, the big thing is for us, for Radio Free Asia and Radio Free Europe, the uniqueness is using this surrogate journalism model. So in most of the times, we don't have reporters on the ground in these very difficult media environments or these societies, period. So we have to be even more installing even more higher standards on our journalism. And this is why people trust our reporting. We have reporters that have the language skills, networks, knowledge of the place. And this also plays into, I think, a bigger topic about the public funded broadcaster, public funded media, that we can just focus on the quality of journalism and earn the trust of the audience in a time that they are going to see all kinds of stuff on their social media platforms. And on this end, RFA has invested a lot in reaching audience beyond Asia with more diverse content, with more digital products. We have to meet where our audience are, where they are, be it shortwave TV or cell phones. And we have to be even more competitive in our content and be more creative in our storytelling skills to attract them. Because, you know, if you have 2 minutes on TikTok, on Facebook, would you rather watch a dancing, singing video or a really sad Uyghur person being arrested and sentenced to death? So these are the challenges and the things that we've been doing day in and day out. And the other point I want to make is going to Brett. I think how to help local media having that mindset in building out content and media outlets is very important. In the global south, it's almost like a news desert. There isn't any local media. So I think there is a big gap that we can feel. For example, the USAGM, our agency, our mother agency, is now trying to create a new initiative called Global News Service that would provide credible, fact-based content from all networks to the third country's media outlets, traditional ones, legacy ones, or the social media influencers, providing them alternative content that they can use. And the other thing I want to talk about is like RFA, we created a few digital brands like Why Now, Why Now. It's a digital magazine catered to younger Chinese audience. And the thinking, the logic behind it is to appeal to younger Mandarin-speaking audience and building this engaged community with a more niche content. And that has been proven success. We saw Mendoza on Russia. We saw Rappler in Philippines. And we're in a different media landscape information age that we have to be more creative on how we can increase our impact and reach.
Thanks, but there's a lot to unpack here. Again, I know you've done a lot of work looking at sort of U.S. public diplomacy and what both the State Department and USAGM can do to address the very issues that Min has just talked about. Do you have a sense that with the rapidly evolving information space, even though the United States has been thoroughly outcompeted in many parts of the world by the Chinese and Russian state media apparatuses, that there is still an ability with the right resources and the right, new ways, innovative ways of reaching audiences, that we can get some of these audiences back?
Sure. I mean, well, I'll back up to one of the truisms is it doesn't matter how good your message is if your policies are unpopular. So we can spend, however much money we can throw at the issue, if ultimately the US is seen as a not particularly good partner to other parts of the world, it's not really going to matter how good USAGM is able to function in those regions. That being said, I haven't looked at the fiscal year budget this year, but when we did reporting on this the last couple of years, the Spanish language budget for Voice of America, Voice of America, was like in the $10 million range. I mean, that's not a lot when you look at the US government budget. And so certainly more resources can go towards that. I will say on, sort of an optimistic note, when we started talking about this in 2018, 2019, we didn't get a lot of bites from the Hill or anywhere else, really. There has been an increased focus on the fact that we are not performing particularly well in Latin America, in Africa in the last 2 or 3 years. So that's a step in the right direction. I mean, you got to start with people actually caring and understanding that there's an issue there. But I think the initiative Min mentioned, which I wasn't actually aware of, is great. And I think that's what we should be doing. I mean, we have 40 million Spanish speakers in the US. A lot of them are very good content creators. Like, let's get that content distributed to content-starved networks in places where their only alternative has been, in some cases, to get Chinese and Russian content. So you don't necessarily need the US government to spend $100 million to set up this massive global media apparatus in Africa or in Latin America. You just need to be, I think, a little bit more strategic about distributing content well. Because the game is not just about content creation, which you have to be good at. It's about dissemination as well, and distribution. So I would love if that would really be the focus of the US government, because again, we have an amazingly creative independent media sector. We have great content creators in Hollywood, and we have a lot of Spanish speakers here. So like, let's use the private sector and just work to distribute that content in places where it's needed.
Reedman, I don't know if you had any further reflections on sort of how in your organizations you could expand your reach. I mean, in some of the new innovative ways you've talked about, I think, get at that. But we are working from behind here in a way, which is not the fault, I think, of either of your organizations. It's just sort of the reality that we've lost sight of the fact that these regimes sort of double down on this particular sort of asymmetric tool of gaining influence around the world, and now we're catching up, as you just said. So from your perspectives, what more can we do to sort of close the gap?
Yeah, I cannot agree more with what Brett just said. We spend a lot of money. It's not even, I don't even think it's a money issue. Like, of course, China pours what I think the number was like 60 billion or something for propaganda. But it is the dissemination, it is how you deliver the content to whom. You can have the best content in the world, but no one knows. So there is gotta be a strategy. There's gotta be people going into these markets to market the content itself and understanding each market's situation and know how we can up our game. Just for example, like in global South, just say like in Thailand, there are many Mandarin media outlets there because there are a lot of Chinese-speaking people living in Thailand, and there is English media in Thai, and there's Thai media in Thai. And a lot of them, when it comes to China, reporting on China, they rely on Xinhua and CCTV. So a lot of them won't be able to afford subscribing to AP, Reuters, or AFP. So how do we get resources and help to them? Whether they take it or not, I think it should be available to these local media to help the quality of their reporting and help us to get into the game. I do not think CCP has any silver bullet in doing this. They just discovered this much earlier and started much earlier. And we now are catching up. And I think this new effort, like repackaging, curating, and finding a way to get more partners. I also like what Brett just said. We need more partners in the global media landscape to work together, not just dumping our narrative there, but us journalists to journalists. These are the fact-based information that we all want to publish, we all want to share. I think that's what I thought, going forward, one of the recommendations that we can give to the Hill, to whoever that can give resources to do this type of work.
Yeah, if I can just pipe in a little bit there. I think obviously everything is going to be a little bit of a resource issue. And as someone in an organization, more resources are always welcome because you never really feels like you ever have enough to work with. But I think there's also a bit of, just speaking as a correspondent, as a journalist, someone who's reporting, it's a bit of, I think that this maybe applies to all of journalism. right now, where we've been the last couple of years, is finding new ways to tell stories, to deliver the information, going where the audiences actually are. And I think a lot of those trends are even, amplified even more when we start looking at the global south, where people are consuming most of their things on their phone. That's happening in the US, that's happening across Europe as well. But I think especially in lots of other parts of the world, it's phone only, it's short form video, things like that. It's tough to deliver information in that way. But also I think that there needs to be a bit of a mindset change and, recognition that, like I may come from a magazine background, and you're like, yeah, I'm going to do this 4,000 word investigation, this detailed thing. But most people aren't going to read something that way, finding ways to, you still need to do those things, but how to deliver it, how to chop it up, how to take those same ingredients and present them in a very different way, I think is a big part of it. And I think that maybe involves bringing in a new outlook, bringing in some resources to kind of shake things up in a bit, because I think that, there can be a tendency, I think I'm not shocking anyone when you say in any kind of large organization, public organization, right? You can get into, this is a way that we've been doing things, but you can never be doing things the way you've been doing them. You always need to be innovating and pushing it. And that's a very hard thing to maintain. And I think even more so in a public kind of organization.
Well, thank you both for sharing those thoughts. I think we're going to turn now to the audience Q&A, as we're about at the 15-minute mark. So we have a question from VOA to all participants. Are there similarities between Russian propaganda regarding Ukraine before Russia launched a full-scale war and trends in Chinese propaganda before and after the elections in Taiwan? And then a broader question, can we say that certain signs of propaganda can serve as clear signs that a country is preparing a military action? Oof, that's a heavier one. Who would like to address either of those two questions? At least the change in tactics, we probably.
Well, I'll actually try to start with the last
right.
one, which if you look at Russia's information strategy before the full-scale invasion, I think that probably is not what we'll see again. So it's maybe not a great sort of lesson learned kind of training ground there, because Russia's approach before the invasion was to say that even the thought of an invasion was just absurd and Western propaganda and it wasn't going to happen. And that was actually very, very damaging for Russian credibility in the first 6 months of the war, because you had all of these people who worked at these outlets around the world who I think genuinely believed this message and were putting their own credibility on the line, putting out memes that were sort of mocking the US of being these, sort of crazy propagandists. And then like, whoops, you got tanks rolling in, and you had a lot of people quit because they just couldn't square what they'd been saying with what the reality was. So I don't think we will see Beijing adopt that if there is an invasion of Taiwan, which obviously we hope there isn't. So I'm not sure that there's going to be a lesson learned there. If there is, it would be an odd strategy to try to replicate. The first part of the question, I don't know if I could necessarily say that we saw similarities between the sort of post-election in Taiwan and the post full-scale invasion, or I guess before was the question. So yeah, I don't know. I would maybe kick that to my colleagues. I mean, clearly we saw Russian disinformation tactics trying to dehumanize Ukrainians and establish them as the radicals and extremists. I don't know if we've seen the same thing with Taiwanese, maybe to a degree with some political figures, but Min would probably be far better positioned to answer that question.
Yeah, I think, before the election, as we just discussed a couple years ago, the Wolf Warrior style was very popular. They go head on, they go really strong. But during the Taiwan election, they did try to mock certain candidates, their background, like taking briberies, having extramarital child, things like that. But I want to quickly point out a bright spot in this very in this discussion is I don't think Russia and China are always successful. I mean, just look at how much resources that China pour into manipulating Taiwan's election. It didn't shift the results. So I just want to provide that so we can have some hope in the general public audience. They have also learned to be more sophisticated in this. Not everybody, but there is hope.
So, Reed, you have a two-finger there?
Maybe I'll pass on. I was going to say maybe I think that Min kind of said everything I was going to say. So,
Got it. Here's an interesting question. So the Kremlin has frequently utilized a decentralized approach to influence and information operations, including outsourcing to local actors or proxies, and in effect, franchising, as the audience member says, franchising these operations out. Could the CCP follow a similar approach, or will it remain centralized in state media and spokespeople?
I can hop in there. Obviously I don't have a crystal ball. I'm not sure exactly what's going on in those rooms, but I mean, from everything that I have ever seen or heard, it's a extraordinarily centralized model how a lot of these, the outlets will work in practice, especially like a place like I'm thinking of, my experience, a bureau on the ground in Central Asia, for instance, right? You have your top level managers, they're always going to be Chinese. I mean, there's still a bit of a distrust from local staff that exists a little bit, and especially in terms of holding management roles. So my first response would be, I think that would actually be quite difficult to replicate. I mean, I think that you are seeing the Chinese starting to, things are going to change, but I think that's a hard thing. I think that's the biggest struggle it's been for China in a lot of ways, as it's really stepped out globally with a lot of this stuff, is, taking what it knows, what works at home, which is quite effective, but obviously you have this very walled off, tightly controlled environment. But when you're out in the wild, it's a very different sort of thing, and you can't rely on those same mechanisms. But I'd be curious to hear what everyone else thinks.
No, I agree with what Reed just said. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think even when you look at the staff who have been hired locally by the Kremlin or Kremlin state-backed media and Chinese state-backed media, tend to be very different kinds of people. The PRC tends to hire sort of very professional, run-of-the-mill kind of journalistic style, where the Kremlin's has a little bit more appeal to kind of younger, more digitally savvy, and there's just a sort of different tone to even the presentation. So you get this sort of New York Post style reporting from Russian state media, which you don't really see all that much in Chinese state media. I mean, a little bit in Global Times sometimes, but even that it's different. So I would agree. I would think it'd be unlikely that we see PRC state media go the Kremlin route and just kind of hiring young people who have a certain mindset and worldview and letting them run wild. I don't think that's going to fit with their modus operandi.
Great. Here's a good provocative question, given that we're in a major election year, and it's a question that we do a lot of thinking about here at GMF. In the election context, are Russian and Chinese objectives shifting to long-term goals of eroding democratic discourse and democracy, rather than seeking to influence a particular outcome of an election? Hence, recent unsuccessful election interference might be because their aims have shifted. You want to start with that, Brett, since we think about this a lot, and then we'll turn it over to Min and Reed.
I mean, I do think most of the time Russia or China interfere in election, they do have a preferred candidate, preferred outcome. I think it's sometimes unfortunate that we have covered it as just their only goal is to sow mistrust. I think that is a secondary effect, and they're very happy in some cases if that's the only outcome. So if you look at the US election coming up, I mean, I think it's not a stretch to say the Kremlin has a preferred candidate for obvious reasons. If they don't get their guy to win, I think if you end up with half of the country mistrusting the results, if you have a more polarized electorate, that's a win too. So there are side advantages. But, I think if they're going to spend the resources to try to interfere in an election, I don't think their only goal is to try to undermine democracy. And again, I think there's different goals from China and Russia. Russia is fine with chaos. I don't think in many parts of the world, China would see that as being advantageous.
Min or Reed, anything to add there?
Yeah, I am not sure, on this from CCP, like they of course has its own agenda, but I don't see how they would be overtly trying to influence our election here. And the other point I want to make is that I think, for what we do, this is the time that for us to cater to the Chinese domestic audience, to let them know what's really going on in the United States, that as our sister organization VOA does too. And that part of their job, I think it's very important in countering whatever disinformation they would put out there. Because mostly, I think that CCP want to demonstrate the chaos in the US election campaign, the chaos in American-style democracy. This is what they mainly want to sell. And our job will be covering what's really going on, in the US, and also carrying the Chinese, for RFA, carrying the Chinese response out to the Chinese people and to the Western world, that how they are responding to this. And also, I think that Congress really understands the importance of having media outlets like us and Radio Free Europe to keep its independence in covering these issues. And that is critical to the credibility of how we are covering this US election that's so important to many, many countries.
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, in my personal opinion, I mean, I think the scariest types of disinformation are always the ones that have domestic origins, and I think are probably the most harmful. I mean, I think, obviously, as everyone said, I mean, the Russians are a lot more comfortable with sowing the seeds of chaos or turning on the fire hose of falsehoods, as people like to say. I think a thing also that always sticks out to me when looking at on the China side of things is, there is the very outward, the one engaging with the world, that kind of messaging, but there's also a lot of reporting what's happening in the country just to send it back home, which I think more in the context of American elections, I mean, I think it's shown, look at this messy, ugly process of democracy. Aren't you glad that we have stability? And I think that message is then getting sent to other parts of the world that are also more authoritarian and have governments that are very okay with China, then broadcasting that message as well to their own people. I think of just a very basic example. I remember once years ago, I was a freelance journalist and I wrote this thing for the Washington Post, looking at the legacy of House of Cards as a TV show. And that's like a famous thing. It shows this really grimy, gross look at what American politics and democracy really are. And Iran let it air on TV for everybody to watch just because I thought it was just so damaging. Look at what America's really like. It was one of the most downloaded and watched shows in China in its second season. All these things, it was huge in Russia at the time. So I think there's always this other side of the blade here when we're talking about this in terms of yes, it's interfering of things abroad, but also then taking that and sending that message back home to their own people. I think is a really big part of the equation.
Well, we have so many more interesting questions that are coming in. It's such a thought-provoking conversation, but we are about to hit time. The sad news is this is a very evergreen topic. So we can go on for hours talking about all of this. So hopefully we have another opportunity to continue this conversation. With all the elections coming up this year, clearly there will be a lot more discussion of this nexus of Chinese and Russian state-sponsored information manipulation and disinformation. Min, Reed, Brett, thank you very much for sharing your insights. Please do, everyone in the audience, continue to support Radio Free Asia, Radio Free Europe. Check out our tools here at the Alliance for Security and Democracy at the German Marshall Fund. We are covering these issues every day. Thank you for your attention, for your participation, and we will see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.